The last one we're going to talk about today is why Benchmark invested in Riot Games. And so if you're playing the game at home of, which of these three don't relate to the other two, you would certainly pick Riot Games. eBay and Uber, as we read, are the most lucrative returns on their investments Benchmark has ever made, competing with some of the greatest returns in venture capital history. And they've had more multi-billion-dollar outcomes like Snap and New Relic and Confluent, which, again, you can read more on my website at allthingsvc.blog. I talk about them more there. But for this episode, I wanted to take a different angle. And so first, I'll lead by saying that this investment was in no way a fund returner or a fund multiplier like the eBay or Uber investments were, or like a Snapchat. It was certainly a great standalone investment. But in the venture capital world, many would consider this Riot Games investment like a double. Because in 2008, Benchmark invested $3.5 million into Riot Games for 20% of the company. And in 2011, Riot sold to Tencent for $400 million, yielding Benchmark a fantastic 104% IRR and a strong 23x on their investment in just 3 years, but a measly $80 million return on that investment. And so, again, as an individual investment, that is fantastic. But in venture capital, the goal is to invest in startups that will return more money than the entire fund, because the majority of companies VCs invest in will return no money. It's a power law industry. So the winners really need to win. And the fund that invested in Riot Games was a $425 million fund. So the goal is to invest in companies with a $425 million and above outcome. And so while Riot Games failed to meet that criteria and could be considered kind of a disappointment in that way, there are many lessons founders and investors can learn from that deal. So that's what we're going to get into right now. So let's set the stage a little bit. Here's how former Benchmark partner Mitch Lasky described Riot Games when he led the deal and invested. He says, quote, "When I invested in League of Legends, the game that Riot Games produced, there were maybe 20 people in the company and they had a wireframe. They had nothing playable. They had no metrics. They had nothing. I went in and Brandon and Mark, the founders, had a background that wasn't necessarily the kind of background I look for in games founders. Number one. Number two, they'd never made a game before. Number three, they'd never made a game with the team they had assembled before. In my experience as a publisher, having published hundreds of games, these would have all been huge red flags." End quote. So all red flags for Mitch Lasky. Also, for those who don't know, Mitch Lasky is widely regarded as the best games investor of all time. Before Benchmark, he held a senior position at Activision. He led the company Jamdat as CEO to a $680 million acquisition by EA. And he's invested in several game companies. So if your company is flashing red flags from him, you certainly have some red flags. Also, side note, Gamecraft podcast by Mitch Lasky and Blake Robbins. Fantastic. Anyway, so Mitch Lasky, did end up doing the deal, obviously. So what happened? How did this company signal all red flags to Mitch Lasky and he's still invested? Well, again, he tells the story better than I could, so I'm going to use another quote about how he says the meeting went. So he says, quote, "I went into the meeting thinking, okay, this is a courtesy meeting and 15 minutes, I'm out of here." 15 minutes into the meeting, I was thinking, Jesus Christ, I'm going to do this. I'm going to invest in this company. These people are so compelling. They're going to die to make this product, and they know exactly what they're doing, and they're able to answer all my questions and anticipate my questions in ways that I couldn't have even imagined. I was like, bring me Steve Snow, who at the time was their executive producer, because I was like, I need to talk to the guy who actually knows how to make a game. I want to spend an hour with Steve. And I spent some time with him, and he convinced me that these guys had their head screwed on straight. And I was like, boom, and I greenlit the investment, end quote. And so I love that quote. To go from, okay, this is a courtesy meeting and 15 minutes out of here, to 15 minutes in the meeting to being like, I'm all in, I'm going to invest. That's just such a funny change of mentality for the investment. And so Peter Fenton, recently former Benchmark partner, but longtime Benchmark partner, has a quote that relates to this idea that investors should really remember, which is the idea of just always taking the meeting, even if it's a so-called courtesy meeting. He says, quote, I start with the premise, emphatic yes, let's meet, because I have and always will create time as much as it may impact. When I don't have enough time to take that next marginal meeting, I shouldn't be practicing, end quote. And so good thing Mitch listened to Peter Fenton here and answered the request to that meeting with a yes, because apparently this was one of the easiest investments he's ever done, because 15 minutes after meeting the founders, barely knowing anything about the company, going in with a mindset of no, turned it into a yes after 15 minutes. I mean, that's got to be one of the easiest investments he's ever done. I mean, he was all in. And so it takes a very open mind to completely flip your mindset on an investment, especially one that apparently had all the possible red flags in your typical playbook. But the founders had an incredible insight that made perfect sense to Lasky. And this is the last time I use the Lasky quote, but he just tells the story so well. And this is a really interesting idea for founders, so definitely listen up. He says, quote, I think part of the pitch that Riot made to me that made me convinced that it had a distribution advantage and made me willing to invest in it was the way they understood the existing audience for Defense of the Ancients, which was a game that was a mod of Warcraft 3. Side note, for those who don't know much about video games, a mod is a user-created modification to the game. So the game was World of Warcraft 3. Some developers built on top of World of Warcraft 3 to make a separate game within that game that people could play. It's the best way I can explain it. Anyway, back to the quote. He says, they were going to turn it into a standalone product and relaunch it online with its own characters and own IP. You could see that as a studio bet on a certain level, but they had identified this enormous pool of users who were playing Defense of the Ancients, the modification. There was this crazy pent-up demand for exactly what they were going to do, because modding Defense of the Ancients and running it as a user, you have to find an out-of-print copy of Warcraft 3 and go through all these headaches just to play the game. And so, again, as we talked about earlier, the game that Lasky is talking about here is League of Legends, which today makes billions of dollars a year in revenue from selling virtual goods within their game, like character skins and rare potions that can give you double XP for your character, things of that sort. Everything online, 99.9 gross margin business, the best business you can possibly have. Anyway, and so I love the way Lasky describes this insight by the founders, because it's actually what many software businesses do. So companies that think gaming companies have nothing to do with you, if you're a SaaS company, listen closely, because David Sachs, for example, a founding partner at Craft Ventures, one of the best SaaS investors out there today, he says an easy way to start a SaaS business is just see what crazy loops people are going through to make certain dashboards on Excel and just turn that into a standalone product. And so the founders of Riot recognized that there was so much demand for this adjacent game that was a modification off of the original game of World of Warcraft 3, and it was growing. this user base playing this modification was growing. It consistently added users despite it being so hard to play since World of Warcraft was out of print. So you had to somehow buy a used copy just to play a modification of the game itself, not even to play real Warcraft 3, to play some made up game that someone created on top of it. And so Riot saw an opportunity to take that underserved user base and build a standalone game just for them, just for that underserved user base, that would enhance their playing experience and eliminate all the hoops they had to go through. And even better, they were going to use, as I mentioned earlier, this now common but novel at the time free to play business model. So rather than having to buy an expensive out of print copy of an old game, Riot would be giving users a better playing experience, better graphics, better game engine, with very similar game mechanics. The only difference was they had original characters and original IP, and the other massive difference was that they were giving all of this away for free. Like I said, they were going to make money on virtual goods, which I'm sure many investors in 2008 would have thought this was crazy. But Lasky, being the GOAT of games investing, saw this as a huge opportunity. He had seen this work, this idea of free to play and selling virtual goods on top of the game, work a few years ago with the game Kart Rider in South Korea. And so he figured it could work in this game. And not any game can pull this off, this free to play and selling virtual good model. But he thought it could work with League of Legends because League of Legends immediately had a strong following. Thousands of players were basically users from day one, just once they were aware that the adjacent modification product they were trying so hard to play could play a better and easier version immediately. So they immediately fell in love with it. And because they love the product, they would absolutely buy skins to make their characters look cooler and gain status in the game, or double XP potions to level up quicker and earn new weapons and other rewards and things of that nature. And so I could go on more as a personal fan of the gaming industry because I think this is such an interesting investment. And I could talk more about the revenue models, which I think are genius, but there are just so many incredible insights from the founders, that led to this multi-billion-dollar company with millions of loyal players and sold out arenas of competitions and games. They basically have their own Olympics. I mean, their League of Legends is next level. And it's all because they took the challenging and bizarre, hard to use dashboards out of Excel and put it into its own products. But instead, doing it with something so creative as a video game, that's just so cool to me. It's not just a regular dashboard, it's new characters, new IP, and just something that creative is just incredible. And so I'll close with one last quote from current benchmark partner Eric Vishria, who talks about how magical, never before heard insights by a founder are. He says, quote, "Having that insight, that's the part where you're sitting in the meeting, you're 3 minutes in, and the founder says something you've never heard anywhere else. Nobody has said it. Nobody's put a blog post down on it. It's an insight. And that insight is the magic." Even Mitch Lasky hadn't thought of this insight by the founders, of taking this mod, building this whole new product off of it, and just immediately hitting a gold mine. I mean, it was truly magical, and clearly this insight has been proven over several years and several $billions in revenue. Truly magic.